I was standing in the back of the funeral home, wearing a black dress I'd bought 2 days earlier because I didn't own anything appropriate for burying my father, when my brother Daniel put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Dad would be proud of how strong you're being." I remember thinking at the time that it was a strange thing to say. Strong wasn't a choice. Strong was just the only thing left when you'd spent 11 years running your father's company for a salary that barely covered rent, while everyone in the family quietly assumed you'd inherit nothing because you were the responsible one, and responsible people apparently don't need to be rewarded. My name is Claire Hale, and for most of my adult life, I believed my father loved me the way fathers are supposed to love their children. Imperfectly but honestly. I believe that even when he passed me over for promotions inside Hale Industries, the manufacturing company he built from a single leased warehouse in 1987, it was because he was testing me, preparing me the same way he used to make me run the numbers on the shop floor before I was allowed to sit in on a real meeting. I believe that when my younger brother Daniel was handed the title of vice president at 26, while I was still called office manager at 31 despite doing the work of 3 departments, it was simply how family businesses worked. Sons take the name forward. Daughters keep things running quietly in the background. I believed a lot of things before that funeral. I stopped believing most of them within 6 weeks. My father, Robert Hale, died on a Tuesday in March of a heart attack in his office at his desk, with his reading glasses still on and a half-finished cup of coffee going cold beside a stack of purchase orders. I was the one who found him. I want to tell you that detail not for sympathy but because it matters later because of what I found on that desk and what I didn't find and how long it took me to understand the difference. The funeral was exactly what you'd expect from a man who spent 40 years building something with his hands and his stubbornness. Half the town showed up. Men who used to work the floor with him in the 80s stood in line for 2 hours just to shake my hand and tell me how much he talked about his kids. My mother, Diane, wore sunglasses indoors and accepted condolences like she was accepting compliments. And Daniel, my little brother, who I'd protected since he was 7 years old and terrified of thunderstorms, stood at the front of the room like he already understood something the rest of us didn't. I didn't think much of it then. Grief makes everyone look a little far away. The will was read 8 days later, in a conference room I'd sat in 100 times before, always as an employee, never as a daughter waiting to hear what she was worth. Our family lawyer, a stiff, careful man named Arthur Whitfield who had known my father since they were both 24 years old and broke, read through the document in that flat, practice voice lawyers use when they already know the room is about to fall apart. The house went to my mother, along with the investment accounts. That part didn't surprise anyone. Then came the part that did. 100% of Hale Industries, the company, the equipment, the property, the accounts, every share, every vote went to Daniel. Not 60%. Not 51. Not even a symbolic 10% to the daughter who had built half the current client list herself, who had personally saved the Meridian contract during the pandemic when everyone else wanted to fold, who had worked every single holiday for the last 4 years because someone had to keep the books straight while my father golfed with vendors and my brother focused on strategy, which mostly meant long lunches and a corner office he barely used. I got the house on Bell Lake, a small cabin my father used for fishing trips, worth maybe $80,000. And a note, handwritten, folded once, that Whitfield handed to me separately, almost like he didn't want my mother to see him do it. I didn't read it there. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too hard, and my mother was already dabbing her eyes theatrically while quietly asking Whitfield what the tax implications were for the accounts she'd just inherited. I want you to understand something about me before I go further. I am not a person who explodes. I don't raise my voice in rooms full of people. I was raised to keep my face still even when my chest was on fire, and that room that day was the fire of my life. 11 years of my labor, my ideas, my sacrifices, reduced to a fishing cabin and a folded note, while my brother, who had coasted through most of his 20s on our father's last name, walked out of that room as the sole owner of a company worth, conservatively, $14 million. I drove home that night without turning on the radio. My husband, Mark, was waiting up for me, and when I told him what happened, he didn't say anything cruel about my father, which I appreciated because some small, foolish part of me was still trying to protect the man's memory. He just held me on the kitchen floor while I cried the kind of tears that don't make noise, and somewhere around midnight I finally opened the note. It was 4 sentences long. Claire, I know this isn't what you expected. There's more to this than the will says. Talk to Whitfield when you're ready, not before. I read it 11 times that night. I remember counting because counting was the only thing keeping my mind from spinning off into something darker. Not before. What did that mean? Before what? Before I calmed down? Before Daniel settled into his new role? Before my mother finished spending what she'd already started spending? I didn't call Whitfield the next day. I told myself I needed time. The truth is I was afraid. Afraid that whatever more to this meant, it would either confirm that my father truly hadn't valued me, or worse, that it would give me hope, and hope at that point felt more dangerous than grief. It was 9 days later on a rainy Thursday when Whitfield called my cell phone directly instead of the office line, which was the first sign something was different. He asked me to come to his office alone. Not with Mark. Not with Daniel. Alone, and after hours when the receptionist had already gone home. I sat in my car in his parking lot for almost 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside. His office smelled the way it always had, old paper, coffee, the particular mustiness of a building older than most of the people who worked in it. Whitfield was standing by the window when I walked in, and he didn't sit down right away. He asked if I wanted water. I said no. He asked if I was doing okay, and I told him the truth, which was that I didn't know anymore. Then he walked to his safe, the same heavy black safe that had sat in the corner of that office since before I was born, and he pulled out a folder that had clearly not been touched in years. The edges were soft with age. My father's handwriting was on the tab. "Sich confidential. Your father asked me to hold on to this," Whitfield said. 12 years ago. He made me promise I wouldn't say a word about it unless he died. Or unless you came to me directly asking questions about the company's ownership structure. He was very specific about the wording. He said, and I'm quoting him now, "If she never asks, she never has to know how badly I failed her the first time. But if she asks, she deserves the truth." I remember my mouth going completely dry. "What is it?" I asked. He slid the folder across the desk instead of answering right away, which is a lawyer's way of letting the paper do the talking so he doesn't have to watch your face break. Inside was a document titled Shareholder Side Agreement, dated 12 years earlier, back when I was 23, barely 2 years into working for the company full-time. Back during a period I remembered only vaguely as the bad year. The year the company nearly went under because a major supplier collapsed and my father had to take out a second mortgage on the Bell Lake cabin just to make payroll. What I did not remember, what I had genuinely forgotten, was signing anything. But there it was. My signature, younger, looser, at the bottom of a 2-page agreement stating that in exchange for a personal loan of $40,000, money I had given my father from my small inheritance from my grandmother, money I gave him quietly, without telling my mother or Daniel, because he'd asked me to keep it private, so your brother doesn't feel like he owes anyone anything. I would receive a guaranteed 20% equity stake in Hale Industries, vesting immediately, non-forfeitable, to be honored regardless of any future changes to ownership structure, wills, or company restructuring. 20%. Immediately vested. 12 years ago. I stared at the page so long that Whitfield finally spoke again gently. "He came to me a week after you gave him that money. He said he never wanted you to think he took it and gave you nothing in return. He said you were the only person in the family who never once asked him for anything." I asked the obvious question, the one that had been building in my chest like pressure behind a dam. Then why wasn't this in the will? Why did Daniel get everything? Whitfield's face did something complicated. Not guilt exactly. Regret, maybe. "Because your father never updated the corporate documents to reflect it publicly," he said. "This agreement was legally binding the moment you both signed it, but it was never filed with the company's official shareholder registry. Your father meant to formalize it. He kept putting it off. Then, for years ago, your mother pushed him hard to restructure the company for estate tax purposes, and he let her handle the new paperwork with a different attorney, someone your mother trusted, not me. That new structure listed only 2 shareholders, Robert, and later Daniel, once your father started transferring shares to him. She didn't know about the side agreement?" "I don't believe she did," Whitfield said carefully. "I don't believe Daniel did either. I think your father simply never told anyone but me, and he assumed foolishly that he had time to fix it properly before anything happened to him." I sat in that office for a long time after that, feeling something I can only describe as grief wrapped around anger, wrapped around a strange, aching relief. My father hadn't forgotten me. He hadn't decided I was worth less than my brother. He had made a promise to me secretly 12 years ago, and then he had simply run out of time to make it official. And in the meantime, my mother had rebuilt the company's ownership as if I had never existed inside it at all. But a signed side agreement, kept secret for over a decade, unfiled, unwitnessed by anyone but a lawyer who could vouch for its authenticity. That wasn't a guarantee. That was a fight. And I understood, sitting there, that if I wanted what my father had promised me, I was going to have to prove it quietly, carefully, against a mother who had spent 4 years positioning her favorite child to inherit everything, and a brother who might not even know he was standing on a claim that was never fully his to stand on. Whitfield told me something else before I left that night, something that would matter more than I understood in the moment. He said the $40,000 transfer from me to my father had gone through our family's small local credit union, the same one we'd used since I was a child, and that credit unions like that one kept physical archived records far longer than most banks. He said if I wanted proof beyond the agreement itself, proof that could stand up if my mother tried to claim the document was fabricated or coerced, that record would still exist. I would need to request it formally, quietly, before anyone knew I was looking. Before I left, Whitfield told me one more thing, almost as an afterthought, the way people mention important details right when you're already halfway out the door. He said my father had come back to his office twice in the last year of his life, both times late in the evening, both times asking the same question, whether the side agreement was still valid, whether it would hold up if something happened to him before he got around to fixing it properly. Whitfield told him yes both times. He said my father would nod, thank him, and leave without ever taking the next step to make it official. I think he was afraid, Whitfield said quietly. Not of the paperwork. Of the conversation it would force him to have with your mother. I left his office that night with the folder in my bag, and a strange steady calm settling over the panic. For the first time since my father's funeral, I wasn't just grieving. I had a direction. It's strange looking back how much of that first week was spent simply trying to convince myself the folder was real. I would take it out of my bag at night after Mark had fallen asleep, sit at the kitchen table with a single lamp on, and read the agreement over and over, as if the words might rearrange themselves if I looked away too long. 20%. Immediately vested. My own handwriting, younger and rounder, signing my name on a line I had no memory of signing. I remembered giving my father the money. I remembered the conversation in his truck, both of us staring straight ahead through the windshield because neither of us was comfortable enough to look at each other while talking about something as vulnerable as saving the family business. I did not remember paperwork. I did not remember an agreement. For a few days I genuinely wondered if I'd been so young and so trusting that I'd signed something without reading it, the way you sign a lease or a phone contract, assuming the person handing it to you has your best interests at heart because he's your father and fathers don't trick their daughters. That thought kept me up more nights than I want to admit. Not because the agreement was bad for me, it clearly wasn't, but because it meant my father had kept something this significant locked away for over a decade, and I had to sit with the uncomfortable truth that even the people who love us most sometimes choose silence over difficulty, again and again until silence becomes its own kind of betrayal. I didn't tell Mark everything right away. I told him enough that there was a document that it might mean something that I needed a few weeks to understand what I was actually holding before I did anything with it. He didn't push. He just asked me one question that night that I carried with me for the entire 6 weeks that followed. Do you want to fight for the company, he asked, or do you want to fight for the truth? Because those might not be the same thing. I didn't have an answer for him then. I do now. The first thing I did 3 days after meeting with Whitfield was request my old employment file from HR, my own HR department, in the company I had worked at for over a decade, which felt strange and almost illegal walking in and asking Patricia, who had known me since I was 22, for copies of my own records like I was a stranger. I told her it was for a mortgage application. She didn't ask questions. She printed everything, including old expense reports, old internal memos, and buried in a folder I almost overlooked, a printed email chain from 12 years ago between my father and Whitfield's old paralegal, confirming receipt of a signed agreement and referencing an internal file number that matched the folder Whitfield had shown me. It wasn't just his memory. It wasn't just one signature on one page. There was a paper trail, faint but real, running underneath the surface of the company for over a decade, like roots nobody had bothered to dig up. The credit union record took longer. I had to submit a formal request, wait almost 2 weeks, and drive 40 minutes to a records office in the next town to pick up a certified statement showing a $40,000 transfer from my personal account to my father's, dated exactly 9 days before the side agreement was signed. 9 days. Close enough to be connected. Documented enough to be undeniable. I remember sitting in my car in that records office parking lot, holding the paper, and feeling something shift inside my chest. Not triumph. Not yet. Just the quiet, grounding certainty of someone who finally has proof for a truth she always suspected, but was never allowed to say out loud. During those weeks I kept working at the company like nothing had changed because I needed access to old files, to board minutes, to the accounting software where I still had administrator credentials that, curiously, nobody had thought to revoke. Daniel was busy playing CEO, taking meetings with vendors, trying to sound like our father in tone if not in substance. My mother had started coming into the office twice a week, technically to help with transition, though what she was really doing, I began to notice, was reviewing financial statements with a focus that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with control. It was during one of those quiet after-hours sessions 3 weeks after the funeral that I found the second piece of the puzzle, the piece that told me this wasn't just about a forgotten side agreement. This was about my mother actively working to make sure I never found out about it. Buried in an old email folder that Daniel had never bothered to clean out, I found a message from 4 years earlier, from my mother's personal account to the outside attorney Whitfield had mentioned, a man named Preston Cole. The subject line read, "Restructuring, confidential, do not CC Arthur." In the body, my mother had written instructions for the new shareholder documents, listing only my father and Daniel as owners, and one line near the bottom that I read 4 times to make sure I understood it correctly. Robert mentioned an old arrangement with Claire from years back. I don't think it was ever formalized properly, and honestly I'd rather we not revisit it. Let's keep the new structure clean, just the 2 of them. My mother had known. Maybe not the full details. Maybe she genuinely believed or convinced herself that the old agreement didn't count for anything. But she had known there was something, some claim I might have, and she had deliberately steered my father's new paperwork around it, for years before he died, while I was working 60-hour weeks 2 floors above her, completely unaware that my own mother had quietly written me out of my father's company. I sat at my desk that night for almost 2 hours after everyone left, staring at that email, feeling the last soft edges of sympathy I still had for her disappear like frost under sunlight. I wasn't angry the way I expected to be. I was calm in a way that frightened me a little. I understood in that moment that this was no longer about grief or even about money. This was about a family that had spent 4 years, maybe longer, deciding quietly, in rooms I wasn't invited into, exactly how much of my own life I deserved to keep. I almost stopped digging that night. Part of me wanted to close the laptop, go home, and simply accept the 20% as a private victory, something I could hold on to without ever confronting anyone about how it had been buried. But something about my mother's phrase, "Keep the new structure clean," sat wrong in my chest for days afterward. Clean. As if I were a stain to be wiped out of the paperwork, rather than a daughter who had handed her father $40,000 during the worst year of his professional life. So I kept looking. 2 nights later, still working late under the excuse of closing out the quarter, I found the attorney Preston Cole's reply to my mother's email, sitting further down in the same thread, dated 4 days after her original message. It was short, almost clinical. Understood. We'll draft the new operating agreement listing Robert and Daniel as the sole members. If Claire's old arrangement ever resurfaces, we can address it separately at that time. Address it separately. As if I were a liability to be managed rather than a person to be told the truth. What struck me most, reading that reply at 11 at night with the office lights off around me and only my monitor glowing in the dark, was how procedural it all sounded. No malice in the wording. No dramatic villainy. Just 2 people quietly agreeing to leave a door closed and hope no one ever knocked on it. I think that's what unsettled me more than outright cruelty would have. Cruelty at least announces itself. This was just convenience dressed up as caution at my expense. I printed that email too alongside everything else, and I began to build what I privately started calling in my own head the timeline, a single document laying out every date in order from the $40,000 transfer 12 years earlier, to the signed side agreement 9 days later, to the restructuring emails 4 years ago, to the will that had been read 8 days after my father's funeral. Laid out like that, in a straight line, it stopped looking like a series of unfortunate oversights. It started looking like exactly what it was, a slow, deliberate erosion of a promise, one quiet decision at a time, until the promise was nowhere left to be found unless someone went looking hard enough to drag it back into the light. I printed everything. The side agreement, the credit union statement, the old HR correspondence, my mother's email. I made 3 copies of each, one for myself, one for a safe deposit box Mark and I opened together that same week under both our names, and one eventually for the meeting I knew I was going to have to request, though I still didn't know exactly how it would unfold. What I decided, lying awake next to Mark one night in early May, was that I wasn't going to walk into that company with lawyers and lawsuits blazing, the way my mother probably expected someone like me to eventually do if pushed far enough. I decided I was going to do what my father, for all his mistakes, had actually tried to teach me during those long nights on the shop floor when I was young enough to still think he was the smartest man alive. I decided I was going to lay the truth on the table calmly with proof, and let the people in that room reckon with it themselves. I called Whitfield first. I told him I had gathered supporting documentation and asked him formally, as my father's attorney and the only neutral party who understood the full history, to help me arrange a meeting. Not a legal ambush, not a courtroom, just a private meeting with my mother and my brother, with him present as a witness, where I would lay out exactly what I had found. He agreed almost immediately, and I could hear something in his voice that sounded almost like relief, like a man who had been carrying a secret for 12 years, and was finally allowed to set it down. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday, in the same conference room where the will had been read 2 months earlier. I remember choosing my clothes carefully that morning, not because I wanted to look powerful, but because I wanted to look like myself, steady, plain, unshaken, the same daughter my father had trusted enough to hand $40,000 of quiet faith to, 12 years before any of this began. Daniel arrived first, still wearing the slightly too large confidence of a man playing a role he hadn't fully grown into yet. He hugged me genuinely and asked how I'd been, and for a moment I almost softened because underneath the title in the corner office, he was still my little brother, the one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. My mother arrived 4 minutes later, sharp and composed, already glancing at her watch like she had somewhere more important to be. Whitfield sat at the head of the table, the same folder from his safe now sitting closed in front of him, mine sitting closed in front of me. I didn't raise my voice once during that meeting. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters not just for the story but for what it says about how real quiet justice actually looks. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't cry, though there were moments I came close. I simply began by saying, "There's something about the company's ownership that I don't think either of you fully understands, and I think it's time we all understand it together." Then I opened the folder. I walked them through it slowly. The side agreement, 12 years old, my signature and my father's signature clear at the bottom, the terms explicit, 20% equity, immediately vested, non-forfeitable. I watched Daniel's face change as he read it, not with anger, but with something closer to confusion, the look of a man realizing the ground he'd been standing on for 2 months might not be entirely his. I placed the credit union statement next to it. $40,000, 9 days before the agreement was signed. Proof this wasn't some fantasy or forgery. It was a real transaction, tied to a real promise, made when I was 23 years old and trusted my father enough to hand over nearly everything I had. My mother's face didn't change much during any of this. She was good at that, better than I'd ever given her credit for. It wasn't until I placed the last document on the table, her own email to Preston Cole, 4 years old, the line about the old arrangement with Claire she'd rather not revisit, that something in her posture finally cracked. "Where did you get that?" she said, and it wasn't really a question. "From the company's own email archive," I said. "The same archive I've had access to for 11 years, because I'm the one who set it up." Daniel looked at her, and then at me, and then back at the papers on the table, and I watched in real time, my brother's understanding of the last 2 months of his life quietly rearrange itself. "You knew," he said to our mother, his voice low. "You knew there was something and you had it structured around her on purpose." She tried for a moment to explain it away, something about protecting the family, about not wanting old debts and old favors to complicate a clean transition, about how she'd assumed the old arrangement was informal, sentimental, not something legally binding. But Whitfield, calm as ever, simply slid a copy of the original filing correspondence across the table, the 12-year-old email confirming receipt of the signed agreement, and said quietly, "It was binding the moment they both signed it, Diane. You knew there was a document. You chose not to ask what it said." I didn't gloat. I want you to understand that, because it would have been easy to, sitting there watching my mother's careful composure finally slip in front of the son she'd spent years building up at my expense. Instead, I said the thing I had rehearsed in the car on the way over, the thing I meant more than anything I'd said in months. "I'm not here to take the company from you, Daniel. I don't want to destroy what Dad built, and I don't want to destroy our family doing it. But I'm not going to pretend this document doesn't exist, and I'm not going to keep being the person in this family who works the hardest and asks for the least and ends up with nothing to show for it. I want what Dad actually promised me. 20% formalized on the record starting now." My mother tried once more, her voice tightening in a way I recognized from childhood, the tone she used when she was losing an argument but hadn't yet accepted it. "You're both being naive," she said. Robert wasn't thinking clearly by the end. His health was declining. Who's to say that agreement even reflected sound judgment? It was Whitfield who answered her, and his voice, usually so measured, had an edge to it I'd never heard before. "Diane, that agreement was signed 12 years ago, when Robert was in perfect health, running a company he'd built with his own hands. I witnessed the signing myself. There is nothing questionable about his judgment in that room that day. What's questionable is a decision made 4 years ago, in his final years, to quietly leave his daughter's name off a document while he was grieving his own mortality and trusting the people around him to handle the details honestly. The room went quiet after that in a way I can still feel if I close my eyes and think back to it. My mother didn't have a response. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I watched her search for something to say and come up with nothing at all. There was a long silence in that room. Long enough that I could hear the air conditioning humming, long enough that I watched a bead of condensation slide down the side of my untouched water glass. Daniel spoke first, and what he said surprised me more than anything else that day. "You should have more than 20, he said quietly. "You've run half of this company for years while I was out golfing with vendors, pretending I understood the operations side. I knew that, Claire. I think some part of me always knew that. I just let myself believe Dad's decision was final because it was easier than admitting I hadn't earned what he gave me." My mother started to object, something about not letting guilt make decisions for the family, but for the first time in longer than I could remember, Daniel didn't defer to her. He looked at Whitfield and asked what it would take legally to formalize the original agreement and restructure the current ownership to reflect it properly, effective immediately, with full transparency, filed correctly this time in front of everyone. It took another 6 weeks of paperwork, appraisals, and careful legal drafting to make it official. I won't pretend the process was purely peaceful. My mother pulled back from the company almost entirely after that meeting, and our relationship, which had never been particularly warm, cooled into something more like polite distance than reconciliation. Some wounds, I've learned, don't close just because the truth finally comes out. Sometimes the truth just gives you permission to stop pretending the wound wasn't there. But Daniel and I sat down, just the two of us, in that same conference room 3 weeks after the meeting, and rebuilt something neither of us expected to rebuild. He didn't just honor the 20%. He restructured my role entirely, Chief Operating Officer, a title that finally matched 11 years of work I'd been doing under a dozen smaller names. We started making decisions together the way I think my father, in his better moments, always hoped we would, before grief and favoritism and old family patterns got in the way. The last piece of this story, the piece I think about most now, came almost by accident nearly 2 months after that meeting. I was going through my father's old office, finally clearing out the desk where I'd found him that Tuesday in March, when I found a second letter, tucked into the back of his desk calendar, dated only 3 weeks before he died. It wasn't addressed to anyone. I think honestly he might have written it and simply never found the right moment to send it. It said that he knew he'd let the paperwork slip for too long. That he'd meant to fix it 100 times and kept telling himself there was time. That he was proud of me in a way he never said out loud often enough, because he'd grown up believing pride made people soft, and he didn't want me to get soft in a business that had never once been soft with him. And at the very end, in handwriting that had gotten shakier in his last year, he'd written one line that I keep on a small card in my office now, where I can see it every day. Claire will hold this company together long after I'm gone, whether anyone gives her permission to or not. He was right in the end, even if it took a quiet, patient unraveling of half-buried secrets to prove it. I didn't get justice through anger. I didn't burn the family down to get what I was owed. I found the truth one document at a time, and I laid it calmly on a table in front of the people who needed to see it, and I let it speak for itself. Daniel and I still argue sometimes, the way siblings running a company together are bound to argue over budgets and hires in which vendors deserve a second chance. But it's a different kind of disagreement now, the kind that happens between equals, not between a favored son and a daughter hoping to be noticed. He asks my opinion in meetings now, actually waits for my answer instead of moving on to the next agenda item. Last month, when a major client threatened to walk over a pricing dispute, he was the one who said, "Let's see what Claire thinks before we respond," in front of the whole management team, without a trace of the old awkwardness that used to hang over every mention of my name in that building. My mother and I speak occasionally, mostly at holidays, mostly in careful, polite sentences that never quite touch what happened. I used to think that distance would hurt more than it does. Maybe it will someday when the anger has fully worn off and only the loss is left behind. For now, I've made peace with the fact that some relationships end quietly, without a single dramatic scene, just a slow settling into something smaller than it used to be. I don't think she's a monster. I think she's a woman who spent so many years believing that protecting her favorite child meant erasing the other one, and by the time she understood the cost of that belief, the damage was already sitting in a folder, waiting patiently for someone to open it. Some nights I still drive out to the cabin on Bell Lake, the one my father left me outright, the one that used to feel like a consolation prize and now feels like the place where all of this actually started. The place he used to take me fishing when I was young enough to still think he could fix anything with his hands. I sit on the dock with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, the same way his was that last Tuesday morning, and I think about how strange it is that a promise made in a truck 12 years ago, folded into a letter and locked in a safe, could end up rebuilding a family that had quietly been coming apart for years without any of us fully realizing it. Some inheritances come in a will. Mine came in a folder that sat locked in a safe for 12 years, waiting for someone brave enough or patient enough to ask the right question at the right time. My father didn't fail me the way I thought he had. That day in the conference room when the will was read and my name wasn't on the deed to anything that mattered. He just ran out of time to finish what he started, and it turned out in the end that finishing it was always going to be my job anyway.